Let's get this started. We actually started chapter 3 a little bit inside, but then I took a break in order to give the background of the chapter, which we did last week. So, God willing, my plan today, it's actually rather a short chapter. It talks about the sun rays. We'll see if we could actually, it's going to be more of a text-based class today. That is, we're going to dedicate the hour to reading inside. Obviously, if you have questions, please ask. But with that, we'll go along inside. So if you're looking in the book, it's going to be on page 39. If you're looking in the Kindle, I will share my screen in a moment. Let's just go back to the beginning of the chapter. Uh, chapter 3, questions of identity, right? Perfect. So I'm pretty sure we did it. We got through a nice chunk of it, but because we didn't learn last week, just want to make sure we're on the same, get a little bit of, let's share the screen. Here we go. All right. The flimsiness of existence, section 1. In chapter 1, we were introduced to the Baal Shem Tov's teaching that creation is a constant process. If God would cease for a moment to energize the world with creative power, the world would cease to exist. Chapter 2 continued to explore this theme with a rational approach, demonstrating how God's energetic presence in the world is a logical necessity. But here in chapter 3, we will approach the idea of continual creation from a different angle. The previous discussions have been theoretical. If God would cease to create the world constantly, it would cease to exist. But thankfully, he has not done so, and we are still here. So how is the idea of continual creation meaningful to us now that God has chosen to sustain our existence constantly? So since God chose to sustain us constantly, how are we to understand continual creation? So it's basically a different angle of the same idea that we introduced in chapter 1 about constant creation, but we're going to take it from a different angle. Now, after hearing these true, let me just move that, words, everyone who looks into the matter will thoroughly understand how every created entity is genuinely and literally considered null and void. In Hebrew, that's ayin va'efes. So in English, I've been translating it as nothing, but he quotes it from Isaiah. That's ayin va'efes, which literally would mean null and void. In relation to the the causal power, which is in Hebrew the poel, which is God, the breath of his mouth, within the effect of creation, the causal power, which continually brings all created entities into being, taking them out from absolute nothingness to become something. So that's what's happening at every moment, that God is taking the nothingness and making it into something. While it is true that the world does exist, the fact that a constant creative input is required from God affects the identity of the world. Since we cannot exist for a moment without divine energy, our existence is flimsy and insubstantial. In fact, as Tanya puts it, our existence is null and void. That does not mean to say that we do not exist at all, but in relation to the causal power, which is God, which brings all created entities into being, we are null and void. We are utterly dependent on the causal power, so our existence has no independence at all from that power and is really just an expression of it. But if we are null and void, why does it not seem that way? Why does it appear very much the case that we do enjoy an independent existence? If we're null and void, it seems and it appears that we are independent. And as for the fact, so the Alter Rebbe is going to address that. As for the fact that every created thing appears to us as real and substantial and not null and void, that is only because we fail to grasp and tangibly see the power of God, the breath of his mouth in every created thing. Our senses offer us a veiled perspective of reality. They cannot detect the causal power of God in the universe, so they perceive an effect without a cause. They see the result of what God has produced without noticing God's hand in every detail. Therefore, our senses mistake something which is null and void for being real and substantial. But if the eye were granted permission to see and grasp the spiritual energy in every created thing that flows into it from the utterance of God's mouth and the breath of his mouth, our eyes would no longer perceive the physical, coarse, substantial dimension of the created entity. Obviously, the physical eye can't see something spiritual. So why does the Tanya entertain the possibility here? The Tanya's view is that your reality is determined by your consciousness. You can accept what your senses tell you, that the physical world is substantial and enjoys independent existence, or you can choose for your reality to be determined by the conclusions of your mind. If over a period of time you contemplate the idea that God creates the world constantly and that the universe enjoys no independent existence, after a while, that becomes your truth, your reference point with which you interpret sensory information. You will see a physical world, but you will have trained yourself to not be deceived by its illusion. So you'll see the world, but you'll know that it's an illusion and there's something a lot more. So if you remember in the introduction to this chapter, we explained that the way tzaddikim see the world is through that lens. They see what's deeper. Obviously, they see the world, but they realize that there's an illusion there, and there is really the hand of God that's taking every step, and they see that almost in their consciousness. I want to just pause, and there on page 40, there's a practical lesson. So I'll just, if you have it inside, you can follow along. It's a practical lesson on page 40. Dependency erodes identity. Which is such a cool line, since our existence is dependent on God, we are null and void. So since we are dependent, we have no true being of our own. We simply reflect God. So our identity, I guess, is not a real one because we are dependent on God. So it seems like we enjoy independent existence, but in fact, we are flimsy because we rely on God. We don't have our own existence or identity because we are dependent on God. Which is a pretty cool statement. Okay, so the point that we're trying to make over here in section 1 of this chapter is, and I think you can see the screen now, since even though we can't see what's happening deeper in the world, but since we know that there is a causal power, which is God, that is keeping us in existence, and therefore we are dependent on that, that should itself bring us into our consciousness of knowing that the true existence is going to be from God.
I think it's cool, but it's scary.
Oh, really? Why?
Well, to know that we're null and void. I mean,
I think that's such a powerful idea.
The idea of fearing and respecting God or Hashem, it's also kind of scary too. Anyway.
So Shira saying that are you able to hear Shira? Should I repeat? Shira saying oh, go ahead, Robin. Are you able to hear?
I was going to say repeat it, please.
Shira saying that this idea that we're fully dependent on God and we don't have our own identity. Hey Jeff, you need something? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's going to get there.
Okay.
So do you want to come to me when you have that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Let's see. I'll let the conversation continue. Let me just, here. Let me just turn this around. Oh, and Naomi's in the waiting room. Let's see. Let me just pause that for a moment. Better. Let's just go back to sharing the screen. And it would put us, are we on 41 now?
41.
Yeah? Okay. In reality, the spiritual energy which flows to each created entity from the utterance of God's mouth and the breath of his mouth is the exclusive power that transforms it constantly from null and void into something. So it's the speech of God, which we spoke about as the 10 utterances, is what's taking what was null and void, total nothingness, and making it into something, bringing it into being. And this being the case, there is no true existence other than God. So that's going to be the theme of the chapter, that it's not to say that we don't exist, but because our whole existence is dependent on God, our dependency erodes identity, which was a quote that we said before from the practical lesson. When the Tanya states that there is no true existence other than God and that the universe is null and void, it doesn't mean that we don't exist at all and that the world is an illusion. We do exist, but in a state of utter dependence on God. Like a fetus inside a mother, which has no identity of its own because it has not separated from its source, we are inside God's creative power and still identified with Him. And much more so, since a mother merely sustains but does not create her fetus constantly. Scholars have described this view as panentheism, which is literally all in God. It is not that you don't exist, you just don't exist like you think you do. You are really something that happens within God, like a ripple on a sea of the divine. You are really something that happens within God, which is such a beautiful idea. So similar to the fetus that is being sustained by God, we are inside of God. It's not that we don't exist. We just exist within God, which is such, so that's called panentheism. Has anyone heard of panentheism?
Panentheism.
What do you call it?
Pantheism.
What does pan mean?
All over.
Uh-huh. Oh, like the airline Pan Am
Yeah.
Yeah.
of blessed
Yeah.
memory.
Or pantheism, yeah.
Everything.
I
Like,
mean,
theism.
Theism is
God.
God. Atheism means no.
no God, right.
So panentheism,
Panentheism.
the emphasis is on the pan.
Well, I don't know, but it's too late,
Yeah, yeah.
What, excuse me, what page are we on, please?
We're on the top of 42 now. We just turned the page.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
A Hasidic thought.
Oh, thank you. And actually, as Shira pointed out, there's a Hasidic thought on the page 41 at the bottom. So let's see that. Embracing the truth that nothing exists outside God is the foundational principle. Oh, I love this. Of an awakened mystical life. You want an authentic or a mystical life that gives you a boost or a jolt, is the idea that nothing exists outside of God, meaning everything that exists is within God, like similar to the fetus inside the mother, and really even more because the fetus is just being sustained by the mother, not constantly being created. And but God is constantly sustaining, creating us, but it's all within God. It's not a separate existence. So it's such a beautiful idea. This concept that we are not a separate existence. We are all within God, and our whole existence is the truth to know that we're not outside of God.
Give me a very simple concept, I think. It's kind of what we talked about before. If you think of it 10 utterances, think of the first 4 utterances as the laws of physics of electromagnetic and nuclear forces that hold atoms together and gravity. Without those forces, without the force that holds cells together, we would be null and void.
Right.
So it's the scientists even believe that there's only 4 utterances. There's gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak atomic forces. If those 4 forces, those 4 utterances of science didn't exist, cells wouldn't exist, nothing would exist, it'd be null and void.
Right.
The cells have to constantly recreate through these 4 forces
in order for it to have existence.
Atoms together.
Beautiful.
So I think science, no one would disagree with this thought.
Beautiful. I guess the only difference would be if
attributing it to a creative energy, intelligence, or is it just the 4 principles of science all by themselves?
And also, null and void means it's as if it never even existed to begin with.
What would an atom be if there was no nuclear bomb? The electrons would be gone, the photons would be gone. Literally nothing, not even the energy of that. Just the thought of it. So I think it's exactly.
Steve, you have to come more in person. You add so much.
I'm not.
That's very good. What?
I'm not really here.
I said I complimented Steve for being here. He's like, I'm not really here, which is in line with the Tanya.
So I just want to make a comment though. I've never heard of panentheism before, but that's different than pantheism. So
what does that mean?
Pantheism is like all the gods are, God is everywhere and all the gods, it's kind of almost a worship of nature, and that all the gods are, it's a real broad range of things. So it can, God is the tree, God is the plants, God's in the plants, God is the plants. So pantheism is a ancient Greek mystical thought, and it's not biblical. So the panentheism is different than pantheism. I just kind of wanted to make that comment.
Interesting. But Lynn, the way you just described pantheism, I mean, the way you described it is right in line with constant creation. If God is constantly creating, God is the force in the tree, and God is that like Hashgacha Pratis, which means God is divinely, intimately involved in every detail, it does sound to be in line, but unless, like you said, there's different layers to it or different
It's kind of the
understandings.
worship of all gods. You can choose a god.
Okay, so that's
And
definitely a Greek thing. Okay, got it.
it's very much of a Greek thought. So I just kind of wanted to put that little asterisk in there. I can't really describe it very well, but maybe somebody can find something. But this is different than pantheism.
Got it. And yes, Naomi, we read this, the first section we actually read. It was just because last week we didn't study, and the week before I just did it outside. I just wanted to get back into it, just to answer your comment in the chat.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I saw I had underlined a lot of parts
Yeah.
already, so I figured we must have read it.
Oh,
But you know
good.
what? I can't say I remembered it from before, so it's fine to
Right,
review it.
exactly. Definitely good to do a review. All right, but the goal is we're actually going to finish section chapter 3 by finishing this section. So let's see if we could buckle up and get through it. So section 2, here we go. A physical illustration of panentheism. So this is going to be about the rays of the sun. I gave a little bit of a summary of it last week, but let's see it inside in the Alter Rebbe's own words. Since the notion of our existence being null and void is counterintuitive and a radical departure from ordinary consciousness, the Tanya will devote the rest of this chapter to making the idea more relatable with a physical illustration. It would also be helpful to reread part 1 of the Tanya, chapters 20 and 21, where a different illustration was offered. So we're just going to stick to this one over here. A physical illustration of this is from the sunlight, which shines on the earth and its inhabitants like light rays which have emerged from the globe of the sun, and they are visible to everyone, shining on the earth and in the atmosphere. So you have the sun, the light rays of the sun, and they're shining here. Now, obviously, these light rays are also found inside the physical globe of the sun itself, the globe that we see in the sky. For if the light rays can spread out and shine at such a distance to reach the earth, they can certainly shine in their own locality. Only there, in their own locality inside the globe of the sun, one ray is considered completely null and void. Obviously, you would have a hard time spotting one ray of light inside the sun. But the Tanya's argument here is not simply a matter of quantity, that there is so much light in the sun that one ray is not discernible, but it's an issue of logic. The sun and its rays are in a cause and effect relationship, and therefore, one ray of light is null and void in the sun's globe, since its identity is voided by the sun's globe, which is the source of the light ray. The light ray has no identity within its source. Or, in logical terms, an effect has no identity while it is still within its cause. Such a beautiful idea. God, we're referring to God as the causal power, or in Hebrew, it's the koach, and the poel. The effect is the poel. That's what God is causing. The effect, which is our existence, the world. Within the cause, there's no identity of the effect. Or the light ray is the effect of the sun, but within the source, the light ray is there. It just doesn't have its own identity. It's within the source. And I think the nimshal, the interpretation of this parable would be, as long as we could view ourselves in our consciousness as within this panentheism, as within God, then we're not a separate existence. We're part of that constant creation. And Robin, I think this is going to be really answering your question of why did God make it this way? But let's wait till the end of the chapter to see if it's fully answered. But there's a lot here. Let's see further. Because the light ray is merely an effect of the sun, being nothing other than light shining from the actual globe of the sun, which is its cause. So you have the sun, which is the cause, the light ray, which is the effect. Only in the Earth's atmosphere, which is under the skies, and on the Earth itself, where the sun's globe, which is the cause, is not present, the ray of light, which is the effect, does appear to us all as a separate entity. And it can appropriately be called a real entity. When the ray of light leaves the sun's globe, it acquires its own identity as an effect. So once it leaves the sun, It has an identity. It's now called from the cause, which is the source. Now it's an effect, which is the light ray. But this is not the case when it is in its source, in the sun's globe, where it could not be termed an entity at all. It is just termed null and void, because it really is null and void there, since all that is recognizable there is its source, the sun's globe. That is the only thing apparent, nothing else. So now the Tanya applies this illustration to our case. Similar to these ways, precisely both in image and likeness, mirroring the above analogy of light rays losing their identity within the sun's globe, are all creations, voided of their separate identity by the flow of divine energy from the breath of his mouth, which flows to the creations, brings them into being, and is their source. Let me just read that line again. Let me see that sentence. Are all creations voided of their separate identity by the flow of divine energy from the breath of his mouth, which flows to the creation? So it's the energy of God, meaning God's speech, that is flowing to the creations, and it brings them into being. And this energy is their source. And the creations themselves have no more identity than a light ray which emanates from the divine source of flow, the breath of God, which flows into and becomes embodied within them, transforming them from nothing to something. So you have the source, which is the divine energy, which is the breath of God, that is flowing and gets embodied in the creation and gives them an identity. It gives them a source of something, but it's coming from nothing. It's coming from the source of God, the sun in our analogy. Therefore, their identity is voided by their source, like the sunlight within the globe of the sun, which has no separate identity and is considered literally null and void, and while it is within its source, cannot be termed an entity at all. And only in the Earth's atmosphere below the skies, where its source is not present, can it be called an independent identity. Okay, let's just read one more paragraph and maybe pause and take questions if there are any. Our perception of the world is like the ray that has left the sun. We discern the existence of separate things, but in reality, the world's existence resembles a light ray inside the sun, which has no identity of its own and is absorbed in its source cause. So this is such a powerful idea. Just this last paragraph really helped explain it. So I just want to clarify it and then tell me if you have any questions. The way we look at the world, as the way the world looks at ourselves, is there's a God, there's a causal power, and then there's an effect, which is world. So that's the light rays that are coming from the sun. So we look at the light rays as an existence. But in truth, the light rays, the way they are still in the sun, they're not an independent existence. You don't even refer to them as anything. They're null and void. It's not that they don't exist, but it's just logically, you don't look at the light rays as anything when it's within the sun. So really the way our perception of reality should be is that even while we are here, we are still within that panentheism idea. We are still within God. We are still within the sun. So even as the effect comes out, it's not a real existence. It's still part. It's the acknowledgement of the null and void that we are still within the sun. So we are an existence, but we are not an independent existence. We are still within the godliness, and our whole source of divine energy or flow is what's keeping us in existence. So our perception of reality should be with one that sees us within God still, not leaving the godly force and creating our own separate entity. Let's just see that practical lesson on 43. If you were able to see the divine energy that sustains the world constantly, you would see that everything is God. Such a powerful idea. If you're able to see that divine flow, which means the embodiment of everything is the energy of God inside of it, you would see that everything is God. And like I said in the introduction last week, that tzaddik sees that reality in everything. We have to train ourselves to see it, and the tzaddik, I guess, train themselves to see that reality. Powerful idea. Naomi, did you have a question? I see your hands up. I'm not sure if it's from before. You're muted, so just
Yes,
Go for it.
I'm looking where I got stopped at this paragraph that starts with, therefore their identity is voided by their source.
Yeah.
And this wording where its source is not present. Okay, this is an analogy with God as the source. I thought, that this isn't worded correctly because God is present, but his presence is not revealed rather than that it's not present, because God is always present.
Yeah. So wait. So which words? Let me just. I'm looking at that paragraph. Therefore,
Page
their identity is voided by their
44,
source. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
boldface, about this, towards the end of the third paragraph from the bottom,
Oh, the third
where
paragraph.
it's a long sentence, so.
And while it is within its
That's it,
source,
yeah.
cannot be termed an entity at all, and only in the Earth atmosphere where its source. Oh, exactly. Where its source is not present, can it be called an independent entity. So why don't you like that? Doesn't that make sense?
Because the source is God, right? And this analogy, the source is God. God is always present, but
Right.
this is not revealed to us. So I think the word should be, its source is not revealed, or its source is not visible to the eye. Because if God is always present, we don't want to say the source is not present.
That's actually, I think you're right in the translation. In the Hebrew, it says she'ein sham mikoro, that the source is not there. Would be is not there. Can it be called in it?
It's not in our perception.
It's not in our. It's not revealed to us exactly. It's not our perception. I would actually agree with you. Thank you. That's actually a good. I'm curious to see from a different Tanya translation if they translated it differently, but I actually agree with you on that. So, and you could look at the next paragraph, right? Our perception of the world is like the ray that has left the sun, but in reality, the world's existence resembles a light ray inside the sun. Okay, I actually would agree with you, Naomi. Oh, and there's one more practical lesson now in 44, so I'll just read that now as well. What you see in front of you now is the divine. God is the substance of all things. There is no thing that is not pulsating with divine energy. Powerful line also. That's that's pantheism. Oh, so Lynn, Steve is here and he's saying that sums up pantheism.
The Greek version of pantheism.
The Greek version, right? That there is no thing that is not pulsating with divine energy. But it's such a Jewish idea, right? That that's what we have to train ourselves to see the divine energy within everything. And we're not a separate existence, that we're still like the light rays inside the sun, that everything in this world, it's like the image I want to have is there's God, and God encompasses everything, and we're in that, like the fetus that's within the mother. That's how we are. We're not outside.
I think the breath of God explains this. When you breathe, on its own, it's a separate entity. But before you breathe it, it's not a void. It's not a breath yet.
I mean, so Steve is saying that it's almost like a breath. There's two parts to it. There's within, while it's still within the breather, and then it's when it's breathed out, then it's separate.
Separate entity.
But I mean,
I'll give you a more esoteric version.
But the Torah refers to the breath of God as outside of it, though. Like, but there's nothing outside.
Is that like a ray of sun?
Right.
Like a ray is, you see it as independent. But like a smile is even more esoteric. When you smile at me, I see the ray, the smile. But in you, there's a thought of a smile, which is not a nothing, which is a nothing. So in a sense, I gotta look at it. If I just saw your smile, I would just see the ray. If I thought, oh my gosh, inside his brain, he wants to connect with me.
Yes.
Then you see a whole different.
Wow.
You see a whole different thing.
So are you able to hear Steve? He's learning. He's bringing the example. Oh, they could hear you. Okay, perfect.
You know what I'd like to, if I could add to, I just looked up panentheism.
Yes.
It's the belief or doctrine that God is greater than the universe and includes and interpenetrates it. And that's exactly what we're thinking.
So is that a Jewish, like, is the word, is it related to monotheism or Judaism, or is it just a general idea that other people?
general idea.
Okay,
The
cool.
Greeks took it and applied it only to the physical world.
Uh-huh.
The Jews applied it to the God. And the Greeks said, no, it's just the physical world. Just a mountain has God in it, but your soul doesn't. There's no soul. So they
So
turned
Steve is saying that pantheism,
to the god Pan.
uh-huh,
The Greek
that
god
that
Pan.
in physical things,
Greeks were celebrating the physical.
so then you have God
was
in
the
there.
physical.
But what about the spiritual
No
and
spiritual
the
world.
soul? Okay, that's pantheism.
Pantheism says that everything is God. The tree is God,
Okay.
leaves are God. Panentheism says that
Physical.
God is greater than the universe.
So could there be a combination of both? Because, when we're saying that there is no thing that is not pulsating with divine energy, I guess that's not pantheism because it's not just physical.
The
It's
thing. No thing.
well,
I
no
just-
thing means everything.
No,
Right.
A smile's not a thing.
Mm.
A thought is not a thing.
Go ahead. Did someone else want to speak?
I just
Okay.
put the search I went to the search engine and I put in the chat box what it says about pantheism. And one is, it's a doctrine which identifies God with the universe or regards the universe as a manifestation of God. I don't know quite what that means. But the second definition is worship that admits or tolerates all gods.
And that's definitely not a Jewish thing. Okay, got it.
Okay.
That's what Lynn was saying before. Okay, got it.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, Lynn.
let's try to finish the chapter. We only have like a page left, a page and a half. So we'll do that before Yom Kippur. Perfect timing. Let's do it. So I'm just going to read that middle paragraph again on the Kindle page, just because it's a very powerful paragraph that I think sums up this analogy of the rays of the sun. Our perception of the world is like the ray that has left the sun. We discern the existence of separate things, but in reality, the world's existence resembles the light ray inside the sun, which has no identity of its own and is absorbed in its source or cause. Similarly, all the creations cannot be termed separate entities at all. So all of creations are not separate entities other than to our physical eyes that do not perceive or grasp the spiritual source of these creations at all, which is the breath of God, which brings them into being. And that is why we see the creations as physical, material, and substantive. Is that how you pronounce it? Substantive? Appearing as a real independent entity, just as sunlight appears to be a real entity when it is outside its source. So in our perception, it looks like it's real, just like the sun, the light rays look real. Our physical illustration is, however, imperfect, as the Tanya now observes. There is, however, one respect in which our analogy does not appear to be a perfect reflection of what it attempts to represent. So until now, the analogy seemed to be fitting perfectly, just like the rays of the sun. It goes outside, and it could be perceived as its own existence. But in truth, within its source, it's null and void. So our perception of reality is the way the suns are outside, but in truth, it's the way it is still within the cause, or in our term, within the sun, within the source, within God. But there's one respect where it's not a perfect analogy, because in our analogy, the source, which is the sun, is not actually present in the Earth's atmosphere or on the Earth. And it is only because the light is distant from its source that the light appears there on Earth as a separate entity. That is not true, however, in reality, where all the creations are continually within their source, God, and it is only that the source is not visible to the eye. Our analogy depicts a shift from an effect. Let me just read that again. Our analogy depicts a shift from an effect absorbed in its cause, a light ray inside the sun, to the effect's emergence from the cause. So it's a little complicated paragraph. To become a separate entity, a light ray on the earth. But nothing ever leaves the presence of God. I'm just going to read this paragraph again. Sorry, I just have to make sure, Steve, you're listening. Okay. Our analogy depicts a shift from an effect absorbed in its cause, a light ray inside the sun, to the effect's emergence from the cause, to become a separate entity, a light ray on Earth. So I don't think I understand those 3 lines here. Did you understand it?
I'm trying to process.
Let me see if I can give you an example.
All right, but you have to speak loud. I want everyone to
Okay,
hear.
well, I'm not sure.
Could
this is
it,
gonna be-
could it be
I'll
that,
give you-
could it be that
Yeah, hold
the-
on, Lynn. Hold on, Lynn. Steve's speaking over here. I'll repeat it just because I don't think everyone can hear.
Somebody say something to you.
Yeah.
It's like the ray of the sun. And
Okay.
you listen to what they say. When you think about why did they say it and what preceded the speech,
Uh-huh.
you're going back
To
into
the
the
source.
source.
Got it.
And you understand it on a much deeper level.
Uh-huh.
And so if you can see all the world like that, you see
the source.
more reality. In other words, someone said something to me. It sounded nice. Was it really nice? Or it sounded mean? Was it really mean? Maybe. And you look back into the source.
Yeah.
It's a training. You look back and see what
We
the
see
source
that.
was. You understand their intention.
Okay.
Suddenly the ray is dissolved and all you see is the
The
source.
source. Okay,
So
so
any thinking of any relationship is predicated on this notion of seeing not just
Interesting.
what someone does, but
very
why.
nice. Uh-huh.
That's the source.
So Steve is saying that it's like the speech when you hear something from someone, but then if you could go deeper and get to the source of why they were saying what they were saying, that would be like the sun ray, which is like the speech, versus the source, which is
You
the
go beyond the letter of the speech.
got it. That's
To
good.
the letter of the law.
Yeah,
You know?
I like that.
That's a Chabad way, right?
So that's how you understand these 3 lines. Lynn, what were you going to add on it? I just want to make sure I understand it also.
I'm just gonna go with that. I think that's great. That's good.
Beyond the letter of the law. In other words, a very Hasidic notion of
Yeah.
you're going beyond
What
the
you
person
see.
said, but why.
Perceiving it.
So that's very Hasidic.
Okay, so let me try to read this again and see if that fits in. Our analogy, which is the analogy of the sun rays, depicts a shift. I guess I don't understand what the shift
So
is.
seeing just the ray to
Ah.
not the intention.
Our analogy depicts a shift from an effect absorbed in its cause. So you have the effect, which is a light ray, but in its cause is in the sun, to the effect's emergence from the cause to become a separate entity, a light ray on Earth. Oh, so I guess that's what he's saying. In the analogy, it's not perfect because in the analogy, there's a shift between the light ray, which is within the source, and the light ray, which is now emerging, becoming separate on Earth. But nothing ever leaves the presence of God. Our eyes may perceive that to be the case, but it does not reflect actual reality. In the Tanya's analogy, we are all rays inside the sun's globe. We are an effect, but not one which has departed from its cause. So I guess that's where the analogy or in Hebrew it's called the mashal, the analogy, and the nimshal, which is the interpretation of the analogy, don't add up. Because in the sun ray, there's the shift from the way it is in the source to the way it comes out in the earth, whereas in the nimshal, in the interpretation, the sun ray, which would be the effect, the world, never leaves the source. It's always going to have to remain within the source.
The original question that Lynn had about the
Yeah.
right wording, that explains
Ah.
that.
Oh,
he
Naomi
agreed-
was asking, right?
Naomi, he's agreeing with you that it was imperfection. because-
Yeah, Naomi. So Steve is saying your question before on the previous page 44, where it says where its source is not present. Steve is saying like that's what the Alter Rebbe is discussing now. That's why it's not a perfect analogy because the source is always present. We're always within the source. It's just not revealed. It's not perceived, but it's there.
Right.
So Steve
So-
is agreeing with you, Naomi.
So what I was gonna say was we get tied up in the effect. We're living in the effect, but that's not the real thing when we see, and we can live our life on this very simple level where we're not connected to the source. And I'm thinking about just holistic medicine. So we're not just giving somebody a pill, but we're going back and saying, what is really going on with you? Let's sit down and talk about your life. Then you're going to have a whole different plan of action because you're connected, you're whole connected instead of just looking at an effect and managing the effect. And I think this is saying with our lives, we're so caught up in the effect, we don't see that we're connected to a source.
Beautiful. And really, like, Rosh Hashanah, I spoke about this idea a lot. And I'll just explain it through one in Yiddish, it's called a vart, one little thought that I heard recently, which is, hey, Alan, I'll be done in 2 minutes, okay? You're perfect. Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry. Okay. Thank you, Alan. We have a lot going on here. We have flooring being done, and we have an air conditioner upstairs being replaced. Thank God, a lot of blessings and a lot of expenses. But it's so on that topic in Hebrew, there's a word for worry. The Hebrew word for worry is da'aga. which is made up of 4 of the first 5 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It's a Daled, an Aleph, a Gimel, and a Hey. A Daled, Aleph, Gimel, and Hey spells the word Da'aga, which means worry. The only letter of the first 5 letters that are missing from these, does anyone know which letter is
Bet.
missing? Is the
Bet.
bet, exactly. So what I heard recently is, why is if already 4 of the first 5 letters are there, why just add the word bet in there and you have all 5 letters? And the answer I read somewhere is that the bet stands for bitachon. The bet stands for trust in God.
Interesting.
And if a person has trust in God, if a person has the bet, there's no room for the other 4 letters. There's no da'aga. There's no worry. So there's one way to look at reality as the effect, where the sun rays, where everything has its existence, and therefore it could cause this turmoil inside of worry and what will be. But if you take it from the bitachon, which is if you go back to the source, if you see, like what Steve is quoting is beyond the letter of the speech, right? Which is if you go beyond the effect, if you go to the cause, if you see us all within God and you see the energy of God within everything, the flow of the speech of God, which is the true source of creation of everything, then you put yourself fully in God's hands. You don't see anything as separate, and therefore there's no room to worry, because all this is the part of the will of God, part of the energy of God, and not just the physical being, the physical creation, but everything that's happening in the world. Every event and everything that happens is all part of that.
And bring them here.
Yeah.
That's that, right?
Yeah.
Not the event, it's that part of that.
But even bad things that seem to be happening
Bad thing
is not really bad, because it's all coming from God. It's such a hard idea. Shira was saying before about her accident. Somehow we have to be able to. You can either perceive it from a separatist perspective, where
perspective.
Yeah.
You don't want to be a victim.
and that's interesting. Okay, let's finish the chapter just to make sure we respect everyone's time. Why are we up to why then? Yeah, why then are all creations not voided of their identity by their source, which is present? Meaning, if the sun is always here, we should all be voided because it is present. And that's what Naomi was saying before. It's present, right? To answer this question, we first need to clarify another matter in the following chapter. The Tanya ends this chapter with a hanging question. This is unusual. Hasidic texts prefer not to shed doubt on matters of faith, leaving them unanswered. In this case, however, it is not God's existence that is being questioned, but our own existence. If we are all within God, like rays of sun in the sun, how do we possibly have any existence at all? Over such an ego-deflating question, the Tanya is happy for us to ponder for a while. So just to explain this last little thing is really cool. Usually a Hasidic text doesn't end off with a cliffhanger, because cliffhanger would mean questioning God's existence. How could God exist? And we don't want to do that. But over here, it's not questioning how does God exist. What we already established is God exists everywhere. So the question is, how do we exist? And if that's the question, we could ponder on that for a little bit without getting the answer right away. So it's not questioning God's existence, it's questioning our existence. And that's a pretty, beautiful way to end off, which is the idea of the sun, in our case, really being God, being everywhere. The question we have is, then if the sun is everywhere, you don't really refer to anything else as a sun ray, as a light of the sun. So if God is everywhere, if the source is everywhere, how do we have an existence? How are we really in existence? Are we really in existence? That's the question. It's an ego-deflating question. It's the way he refers to it in the translation. Okay, awesome. And that takes us to overtime already. Okay, Yasher Koach. Another beautiful, a lot to think about, and just something that's Naomi brought pantheism, as she quoted before, a doctrine which identifies God with the universe, or regards the universe as a manifestation of God. We'll stick with that one. All right, everyone, have a great Wednesday and easy fast. A Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. And God willing, we'll see you next week, Wednesday, after a meaningful Yom Kippur.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Yeah, exactly. Shabbat Shuvah. Awesome.